For decades, the flickering glow of the American television set acted as a hearth, and in the center of that warmth stood a man who seemed carved from the very earth itself. Dan Blocker was not merely an actor playing a role, he was a psychological anchor for a generation that was navigating the turbulent waters of the mid-20th century. When he walked onto the screen as Hoss Cartwright, there was an immediate sense of relief in living rooms across the country, a collective exhale that whispered, "Everything is going to be all right." We often mistake celebrity for familiarity, but with Dan, the connection was deeper. It was a form of communal trust that is almost impossible to replicate in our modern, fragmented media landscape. He represented a specific type of masculine virtue that didn't rely on bravado or chest thumping, but rather on the quiet, immovable strength of a mountain. To understand why his departure felt like a seismic shift in the culture, one must first understand the sheer gravity of his presence, which was both literal and metaphorical. He was the giant who wouldn't crush you, the strong man who chose tenderness over force, and the star who seemed entirely uninterested in the typical trappings of fame. The tragedy of Dan Blocker isn't found in a scandalous downward spiral or a public battle with demons, which is what makes his story so uniquely haunting to those who remember him. It is the tragedy of the unbreakable man being broken by the most mundane of circumstances, a narrative twist that feels like a betrayal of the natural order. We expect our legends to go out in a blaze of glory or to fade slowly into the sunset of old age, but Dan was snatched away at the absolute zenith of his powers. There was no slow decline, no warning signs that the end was approaching, and no opportunity for the public to say a proper goodbye to the man who had become their surrogate brother and friend. This suddenness created a void that never truly closed, leaving a lingering sense of what if that continues to color his legacy today. When we look back at his life, we aren't just looking at the biography of a TV star. We are examining the anatomy of a life lived with immense purpose and the cruel irony of how that life was cut short. Long before he was a household name, Dan's journey began in the dusty expanses of Texas, born in 1928 into a world that was about to be gripped by the Great Depression. He entered the world weighing an incredible 14 pounds, a physical omen of the life he was destined to lead, and by the age of 12 he already stood 6 feet tall. This physical enormity could have easily turned him into a bully or a spectacle, but the harsh realities of the Depression-era South instilled in him a different kind of character. His family didn't have the luxury of indulgence, they had the necessity of labor, and Dan learned early on that his size was a tool to be used for the benefit of those he loved. He spent his youth working in his father's grocery store and hauling heavy loads, developing a work ethic that was as massive as his frame. He wasn't a child who was told he was special because of his height. He was a young man who was taught that with great strength comes an even greater obligation to be useful. The Texas of Dan's youth was a place where grit was the only currency that mattered, and he possessed it in spades. As he moved into his teenage years, his physical prowess naturally gravitated toward the football field, where he became a dominant force that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He played for Hardin-Simmons University and later Sul-Ross State Teachers College, using his athleticism as a ticket to an education that his family otherwise couldn't have afforded. In the locker rooms and on the gridiron, he was the big man, but inside there was a growing intellectual curiosity that didn't always align with the dumb jock stereotype people tried to project onto him. He was a student of human nature, a reader, and a thinker who was constantly observing the world around him with a discerning eye. It was during these college years that the first seeds of his artistic future were planted, though they were planted almost entirely by accident and without any initial ambition on his part. The transition from the football field to the theater stage is one of the most improbable chapters of his early life, occurring only because a drama production needed someone with his immense strength. They didn't need an actor, they needed a stagehand who could move the heavy wooden flats and furniture without breaking a sweat, and Dan was happy to oblige. But as he stood in the wings, watching his peers navigate the complexities of performance, he found himself drawn to the emotional honesty required by the craft. When a director finally asked him to step into a small role, Dan didn't just recite lines. He filled the space with a natural, unforced charisma that captivated everyone in the room. For the first time, people weren't just staring at him because he was a giant. They were watching him because he was making them feel something profound. This realization that his physical presence could be a vessel for vulnerability changed the entire trajectory of his life, leading him to pivot away from a traditional career toward the uncertain world of the performing arts. However, the world had other plans for the young Texan. As the drums of war began to beat across the Pacific, just as he was finding his footing in the world of theater, Dan was drafted into the United States Army to serve in the Korean War, a conflict that would fundamentally alter his DNA. He wasn't sent to a comfortable desk job or a rear echelon position. He was placed on the front lines as an infantry sergeant, where the stakes were life and death every single day. The horrors of combat are often sanitized in the movies, but for Dan, they were a visceral, daily reality that stripped away any remaining youthful naivety. He saw things on those frozen ridges of Korea that he would never be able to unsee, experiences that instilled in him a deep-seated hatred for violence and a profound respect for the fragility of life. This period of his life is the missing key to understanding why Hoss Cartwright felt so incredibly compassionate. That kindness was born from the ashes of a war that showed him exactly how cruel the world could be. During his service, Dan earned a reputation as a leader who led by example rather than by shouting, a man who took the safety of his squad as a personal moral directive. There were documented instances of his bravery, including moments where he stayed behind to cover his men's retreat, using his massive frame as a literal shield against enemy fire. He returned home decorated with the Purple Heart and a deep, quiet trauma that he refused to use for social capital or sympathy. He didn't come back wanting to tell war stories. He came back wanting to build a life that was the polar opposite of the chaos he had witnessed. The military service didn't make him a tough guy in the cinematic sense. It made him a peacemaker who understood that true strength is the ability to remain gentle when you have every reason to be hard. This internal evolution was the foundation upon which his entire acting career would eventually be built, giving him a depth that younger, less experienced actors simply couldn't manufacture. After returning to civilian life, Dan didn't immediately run to Hollywood to seek his fortune. Instead, he sought the stability of the classroom. He utilized the GI Bill to earn a master's degree in dramatic arts and then moved to New Mexico and eventually California to work as a school teacher. This period of his life is often overlooked, but it speaks volumes about his priorities. He wanted to contribute to his community and provide for his growing family before he ever considered chasing a dream. He taught English and drama, becoming a beloved figure among his students, many of whom remembered him not as a future star, but as a mentor who genuinely cared about their growth. He was a man who found fulfillment in the ordinary, in the slow build of a stable home and the respect of his peers in the teaching profession. It was only when the financial pressures of raising a family became too great that he decided to try his hand at professional acting as a side hustle. The early days of his acting career were defined by small, uncredited roles and bit parts in westerns, where he was usually cast as the muscle or the heavy. Casting directors saw a man who was 64 and 300 pounds and immediately put a gun in his hand, assuming he was another typical Hollywood tough. But Dan resisted the urge to play these characters as mindless thugs, always looking for a way to inject a moment of humanity or humor into even the smallest scene. He was a student of the medium, learning the technical aspects of television production with the same discipline he had applied to his studies and his military service. He wasn't looking for a breakout role, he was looking for a steady paycheck to ensure his children had everything they needed. This pragmatic approach to the industry kept him grounded, preventing him from becoming seduced by the ego-driven culture that consumed so many of his contemporaries. Then in 1959, a pilot for a new kind of Western began casting, a show that would focus more on the internal dynamics of a family than on the external conflicts of the frontier. Bonanza was a massive gamble for NBC, as it was one of the first series to be filmed entirely in color, and the casting of the three sons was crucial to the show's success. When Dan walked into the audition for the role of Eric Hoss Cartwright, the producers knew instantly that they had found something special. It wasn't just that he fit the physical description of the middle brother, it was that he possessed an innate sweetness that radiated through his massive frame. He didn't have to act like a good man, he simply was one, and that authenticity was exactly what the show needed to balance the fiery temper of little Joe and the stoic wisdom of Adam. From the moment the first episode aired, it was clear that Dan Blocker had tapped into something universal, creating a character that would go on to define a generation. As Bonanza climbed the ratings, Dan's life underwent a radical transformation that he was never entirely comfortable with. He went from being a quiet school teacher to being one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, with fans swarming him whenever he ventured out in public. Yet, despite the massive fame and the escalating salary, Dan remained remarkably unchanged in his core values and his daily habits. He continued to view acting as a job, a very good job that he was grateful for, but not something that defined his worth as a human being. He was the first person on set and the last to leave, always ready with a joke or a word of encouragement for the crew members who were often ignored by other stars. He understood that the success of the show wasn't just about the actors in front of the camera, but about the collective effort of hundreds of people working toward a common goal. The character of Hoss became a phenomenon in his own right, largely because Dan insisted on playing him with a degree of emotional intelligence that was rare for television at the time. Haas was a man-child in many ways, possessing a childlike wonder and a deep empathy for animals and the downtrodden, but he was also the moral conscience of the Ponderosa. Dan worked closely with the writers to ensure that Haas wasn't just used for comic relief, pushing for storylines that explored the character's loneliness, his search for love, and his internal struggles. This dedication to the truth of the character is what made audiences fall so deeply in love with him. They saw their own vulnerabilities reflected in this giant of a man. He made it okay for men to be sensitive, to cry, and to care openly, a revolutionary concept in the hyper-masculine world of the 1960s Western. Off-screen, Dan was a man of immense intellectual depth, frequently engaging in political activism and supporting social causes that were often at odds with the conservative landscape of the era. He was a vocal supporter of civil rights and was deeply concerned about the direction the country was taking, often using his platform to advocate for justice and equality. This side of him was rarely seen by the general public, who preferred to see him only as the lovable Haas, but it was a vital part of his identity. He was a man who refused to be put in a box, a complex thinker who happened to have the body of a lumberjack and the heart of a poet. His ability to navigate these two worlds, the simplistic world of the Ponderosa and the complex reality of 1960s America, was a testament to his character and his intellect. As the years rolled on and Bonanza became an institution, the pressure of maintaining that public persona began to take a toll on Dan's personal life. He cherished his privacy above all else, but the intrusive nature of 20th-century stardom made it increasingly difficult to live a normal life with his wife and 4 children. He hated the way strangers would approach him and slap him on the back as if they owned a piece of him, a byproduct of the intense parasocial relationship viewers had with Haas. He began to yearn for a place where he could just be Dan, where his children could grow up without the constant shadow of his celebrity looming over them. This desire for anonymity eventually led to one of the most significant and misunderstood decisions of his life, a move that would take him halfway across the world. The decision to move his family to Switzerland was not born of a desire to escape taxes or to snub the country that had made him rich. As some cynical tabloids suggested at the time, it was a calculated, deeply loving move by a father who wanted to give his children a childhood free from the distorting lens of Hollywood fame. In Switzerland, he found a culture that respected privacy and a landscape that offered him the peace he had been craving since his time in Korea. He would fly back to the United States to film his episodes of Bonanza and then immediately return to his sanctuary in the mountains, a grueling schedule that he accepted without complaint. He was a man who was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect the sanctity of his family, proving once again that his real-life values were even more impressive than those of the characters he played. By the early 1970s, Dan Blocker seemed to have figured out the secret to a successful life. He had a career that was the envy of the industry, a family that was thriving in a peaceful environment, and a sense of self that was unshakable. He was only 43 years old, with decades of potential ahead of him, both as an actor and as a man who still had so much to give to the world. There was talk of him moving into directing, or perhaps taking on more challenging dramatic roles once Bonanza eventually took its final bow. He was at the peak of his physical and professional life, a pillar of stability in an industry that was becoming increasingly chaotic and cynical. No one could have predicted that this unbreakable man was standing on the precipice of a sudden and absolute end. The routine nature of his final days is perhaps the most difficult part of the story to digest, as it lacks the dramatic weight we feel his life deserved. He had been suffering from some minor health issues related to his gallbladder, a common ailment that is usually resolved with a standard, low-risk surgery. In May 1972, he went into the hospital for what everyone assumed would be a quick procedure followed by a brief recovery period. He was in good spirits, joking with the medical staff and looking forward to getting back to work and back to his family in Europe. There was no sense of dread, no premonition of disaster, just the quiet confidence of a man who had survived a war and a decade of Hollywood pressure. He walked into that hospital under his own power, a giant of a man who looked like he could live to be 100. The surgery was completed without any immediate complications, and for a few hours it seemed that Dan was on the road to recovery. But then the unthinkable happened, a sudden catastrophic turn that no one saw coming. A blood clot, a silent and invisible killer, moved with terrifying speed from his leg to his lungs, causing a massive pulmonary embolism. In an instant, the man who had been the emotional heart of millions of homes was gone, leaving a silence that was deafening to everyone who knew him. There was no time for heroic measures, no time for final words, just a sudden extinguishing of a light that had burned so brightly and steadily for so long. The news of his death sent shockwaves across the globe, leaving the public in a state of disbelief that turned into a profound, collective mourning. The aftermath of his passing was a testament to the impact he had made, as his co-stars and fans struggled to process a world without Dan Blocker. For the cast of Bonanza, it wasn't just a professional loss. It was a personal tragedy that fundamentally broke the show's spirit. They made the difficult decision to address his death on the show, a first for a major television series, but the heart of the Ponderosa had stopped beating, and the show would only last one more season without him. The void he left was simply too large to fill, a physical and emotional space that could not be occupied by any other actor. His death marked the end of an era not just for the show but for a type of television that believed in the inherent goodness of man. Even decades later, the story of Dan Blocker continues to resonate because it reminds us of the fragility of even the strongest among us. He was a man who lived with immense integrity, who faced the horrors of war and the pressures of fame with a quiet, steady resolve. He didn't seek the spotlight, but when it found him, he used it to radiate a sense of peace and compassion that the world desperately needed. His story isn't just a biography of a TV star. It's a reminder that true legacy isn't built on awards or accolades, but on the way we treat people and the stability we provide for those we love. Dan Blocker may have been taken from us too soon, but the mountain of a man he was remains an immovable part of our cultural history, a permanent fixture in a world that is always changing. The immediate aftermath of Dan Blocker's passing was not characterized by the typical Hollywood frenzy of cameras and tabloid speculation, but rather by a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to descend upon the entire industry. When the news broke on that Tuesday in May, it felt as though a pillar of the American household had simply evaporated, leaving behind a structural weakness that everyone could feel but no one knew how to repair. In the corridors of NBC and on the dusty trails of the Paramount Ranch, the atmosphere was one of total paralysis. Grown men who had spent years playing hardened cowboys were found weeping openly in their trailers, unable to reconcile the image of the indestructible Dan with the reality of his sudden absence. There was no playbook for this kind of loss, as television stars of his magnitude simply didn't vanish at the age of 43, and the world struggled to find the vocabulary to mourn a man who had become a symbol of permanence. For his wife, Dolphia, and their 4 children, the tragedy was a visceral, private earthquake that required an immediate and total withdrawal from the public eye. While the world clamored for a statement or a glimpse of her grief, she chose a path of radical dignity, shielding her family from the vultures of celebrity culture with a ferocity that Dan would have deeply admired. She understood that if she allowed the cameras in for even a moment, her husband's death would be transformed from a family tragedy into a public spectacle, and she refused to let his memory be cheapened by the machinery of fame. This was the beginning of a decades-long silence, a deliberate choice to live in the shadow of his legacy rather than trying to bask in its fading light. She retreated to the life they had built together, focusing entirely on the monumental task of raising their children in a world that would forever define them by their father's absence. On the set of Bonanza, the producers were faced with a creative and moral dilemma that had never been encountered in the history of the medium. Up until that point, when a television star died or left a show, the character was usually replaced or simply never mentioned again, but the idea of replacing Hoss Cartwright was viewed as an act of sacrilege. Michael Landon and Lorne Greene were adamant that the show could not simply recast the heart of the Ponderosa, leading to the landmark decision to have the character of Hoss die within the narrative of the series. This was a revolutionary moment in television history, marking the first time a major show addressed the death of a central character with the same gravity and realism that the audience was feeling in their own lives. However, the writers found it nearly impossible to craft a script that did justice to Dan's impact, and the resulting episodes were filmed in a haze of genuine, unsimulated sorrow that made the season almost unbearable to watch. The technical cause of death, a pulmonary embolism following routine surgery, added a layer of bitter irony to the mourning process, as it felt so unnecessarily random. In a world where Dan had survived the literal trenches of the Korean War and the metaphorical knives of Hollywood, to be taken down by a stray blood clot after a common gallbladder procedure felt like a glitch in the universe's logic. Fans wrote thousands of letters to the hospital and the family, searching for someone to blame or some hidden medical mystery that could explain away the tragedy, but there was no conspiracy to be found. There was only the cold, clinical reality that life is fragile, regardless of how much muscle or character a person possesses. This realization turned Dan's death into a cautionary tale about the illusion of control, a reminder that the people we rely on as unbreakable are often just as vulnerable as the rest of us. As the final season of Bonanza limped toward its conclusion without its middle brother, the ratings began a steep and irreversible decline, proving that the show's soul had departed along with Dan. The chemistry that had sustained the Cartwright family for over a decade was fundamentally broken. Without Haas to act as the buffer between the father's authority and the younger brother's impulsiveness, the dynamics felt hollow and forced. Michael Landon, who had shared a particularly deep, brotherly bond with Dan, found it increasingly difficult to show up to a set that felt like a graveyard of memories. The cancellation of the show in 1973 was almost a mercy, a final acknowledgement that the Ponderosa could not exist without the man who had given it its warmth. The end of the series marked the end of a specific era of American storytelling, one that was perhaps too innocent to survive the cynical transition into the mid-70s. In the years that followed, the Blocker children grew up in a world where their father's face was still beamed into millions of homes every day via syndication, creating a surreal and often painful duality. They had to navigate their own grief while watching a younger, vibrant version of their father provide comfort to strangers, a ghost in the machine that refused to fade away. Yet because of Dolphia's steadfast protection, they managed to build successful, independent lives that honored their father's intellectual and creative spirit rather than just his fame. Dirk Blocker and David Blocker eventually found their own paths in the industry, one as a talented actor and the other as a respected producer, carrying forward the professional discipline that Dan had pioneered. They became the living evidence that Dan's greatest achievement wasn't a television show, but the character he had successfully instilled in his children before he was taken. The silence of Dolphia Blocker remained unbroken for nearly 30 years, a feat of privacy that is almost inconceivable in the modern age of oversharing and tell-all memoirs. She never sought the spotlight, never wrote a book about her life with Dan, and never allowed the media to turn her mourning into a commodity. When she passed away in 1999, she did so with the same quiet grace that had defined her husband's off-screen life, leaving behind a family that was united and strong. Her death was the final chapter in a love story that had been interrupted by tragedy but never conquered by it, a testament to the fact that the values they shared were stronger than the fame that surrounded them. She had successfully completed the mission they had started together in Switzerland, to live a life of substance that was entirely separate from the artifice of Hollywood. Today, the legacy of Dan Blocker is often discussed in terms of what could have been, with many industry veterans believing he was on the verge of becoming one of the great character actors of the silver screen. Directors like Robert Altman, who had worked with Dan in his early career, lamented the loss of a talent that had only just begun to explore its full range beyond the constraints of a weekly Western. There was a unique, everyman quality to his performance style that anticipated the rise of the naturalistic actors of the 1970s, and it's easy to imagine him anchoring prestige dramas or winning Academy Awards in his middle age. But his true legacy isn't found in the roles he didn't play. It's found in the standard he set for what it means to be a gentle giant in a world that often rewards the loudest and most aggressive voices. When we watch old episodes of Bonanza today, there is a bittersweet quality to Haas's scenes that wasn't there during the original run, a layer of melancholy that comes from knowing the man behind the hat. We see the kindness in his eyes and realize it wasn't a performance. It was a reflection of a man who had seen the worst of humanity in war and decided to respond with the best of himself. Dan Blocker didn't just play a character the public trusted. He earned that trust through a lifetime of integrity, education, and service. He remains a rare example of a star who was actually larger than the legend that surrounded him, a man whose physical size was eventually surpassed by the size of his heart. In the end, his story isn't about a routine surgery gone wrong, but about a life lived so right that its absence is still felt over half a century later. Ultimately, Dan Blocker's story serves as a profound meditation on the nature of memory and the enduring power of a life lived with authenticity. He didn't leave behind a trail of scandals or a collection of bitter rivals. He left behind a vacuum of goodness that served as a tribute to his character. He taught us that stability isn't about being invincible, but about being reliable, about being the person who stays when things get difficult and who treats the smallest player with the same respect as the biggest star. As the credits roll on his life, we are left with the image of a man who is exactly who he appeared to be, a steady, compassionate force of nature who made the world feel a little safer just by standing in it. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of the Dan Blocker story, that even a life cut short can be a complete and perfect masterpiece if it is built on the foundation of decency.